So, last time we saw steps towards new directions in the Pac-Man series, all of them missteps. Pac-Man 2 was a frustrating nightmare. Pac in Time had some great ideas but failed to execute them well, and Pac-Attack was a puzzle game. Not a bad puzzle game by any means, just not good enough to warrant changing the whole series into a puzzler. Now, technically the next game in the series here is Pac-Man World to celebrate Pac-Man's 20th anniversary. God, have we really gone through 20 years of games already? They say time flies by when you're having fun, but then again I've played Pac-Man 2 twice now, so that can't be right. Anyway, Pac-Man World would be Namco's next major push for the series, and spoiler alert, it worked. I know a lot of people have a ton of nostalgia for these three games, but after Pac-Man World and before World 2 and 3, we got another trilogy of Pac-Man games in the span of only 2 years. I say Pac-Man games, but actually only one of them stars the original Yellow Dude. We're taking a look at Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness, Pac-Man Adventures in Time, and Ms. Pac-Man Quest for the Golden Maze. I'm referring to these as a trilogy because they all focus on returning to the more classic maze-like structure of the original arcade games, but in reality they're only loosely connected. For one, these two Ms. Pac-Man games are the only Ms. Pac-Man games released besides the original, but also they're not even on the same platform. Maze Madness is a PS1 title, while the other two are both PC games, and even then they're incredibly different from each other. You'll see what I mean when we dive into our first game here, Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness. A little under a year after Pac-Man World, we got a revival of the original style of gameplay with some new modern twists. This makes a lot of sense to me, as it's a much safer bet that it'll succeed compared to the previous titles, and there was certainly no guarantee Pac-Man World would take off either. The game starts off with a lecture from Professor Pac-Man telling us about Pac-World's history, specifically the Gems of Virtue, which help keep 4 special worlds in balance. These worlds are somehow separated off from Pac-World by force fields. But now, dark forces are planning to use powerful black magic to break in and steal the Gems of Virtue. This is when Professor Pac-Man's age starts to show a bit, and I have trouble following what's going on here. Apparently, there's a princess who has been kidnapped and locked in her palace, which has also now become a castle called Haunted Halloween. Professor Pac says the princess hasn't been heard of since. Heard of? Aren't I hearing about this shit right now? Isn't a princess kidnapping something people usually talk about? I've tried to make this plot as understandable as possible, but seriously, I think during the whole opening the professor is having a brain aneurysm or something. The quest begins with Professor Pac-Man showing us his new invention, the Pactrometer, which allows us to travel to those 4 aforementioned worlds of Pac-Land. However, the professor is kidnapped by the evil witch Mesmerelda, and it's up to us to go get the gems before her and try to rescue him. So we're off to Cleopatra to find the Gem of Generosity. Thankfully, we've got the professor's holograms to help guide us on our journey, and here we finally get into the game proper. Right off the bat, you can probably see how the game mimics the original, with mazes, dots, power pellets, and of course, ghosts. Collecting dots increases your score, you can eat ghosts for an increasing amount of points, you get the idea. The differences become more apparent as you progress, however. Rather than dying when you run into Blinky and pals, you've actually got a health bar now, and the game is pretty damn forgiving with enemies barely hurting you typically and tons of health everywhere. The game's split into sections of larger ghost mazes with puzzles in between. Typically you'll reach a maze and you need to eat a certain amount of dots before you can progress. Then on your way to the next maze, you'll be solving block pushing puzzles and trying to forge a path onwards. There's hidden fruit along the way, plenty of dots, extra lives, and brand new enemies. These guys can also be eaten with the help of a power pellet. Quick side note, the mummies here have these realistic human screams when killed. It's fucking hilarious. It reminds me of the Lego Yoda death sound. And while going on about the sound, I love the stupid voice that plays whenever you get a 1-up.
Yeah, cool.
At the end of the level here, everything you've collected is counted up and you're given stars for how well you did. There's one for score, which seems to be pretty much guaranteed, all dots, all fruit, and finally one for time attack. If you want the time attack star, you actually have to beat the level first and then go back and select time attack specifically. And damn is it hard. Here's hoping I won't have to do any of these because they are incredibly difficult. I'm not sure where the extra dots and fruit were, as I thought I found everything, but hopefully it shouldn't matter too much. As the levels progress, they start adding a few new mechanics here and there, like new enemies and flying carpets, but the game really is just dot devouring and block pushing puzzles. I did stumble across this weird green block though. Maybe the rest of the dots and fruit are hidden behind it and I missed something? Eventually the game introduces TNT crates, blocks on a timer that will explode and clear stone blocks, as well as conveyor belts that move stuff around. Sure enough, we reach the end of Cleopatra and grab the Gem of Generosity. The game continues following the structure of Ms. Pac-Man going to new lands to get the respective gem. Next up we have the Gem of Truth and the Crystal Caves, by far the least interesting area in the entire game. Nothing too crazy here, except now we have sliding block puzzles and we have to move ice on top of lava to clear a path. Getting some of the fruit can be really challenging, but honestly the system of mazes and block pushing isn't always super interesting. As I was progressing, I ended up unlocking a bonus stage where you have to win a sled race and collect dots and fruit along the way. And Jesus fucking Christ, these are the worst goddamn ice physics. In order to push enemies out of the way, you have to spin the D-pad, which throws me off balance enough without the ice physics. But also, Ms. Pac-Man barely follows the cat around that you control, and oftentimes you'll accidentally fling her off the edge and she'll pull you down to the pit. It is an absolute misery to control. I better not have to get a single one of those goddamn stars. Finally, we've got the Gem of Truth and it's time to go. Hopefully the next area improves. There were some good puzzles here, but the area is just kind of bland and uninteresting. If I have to spend all this time solving mediocre Zelda puzzles, at least make the setting look cool. Thankfully, Pak-Ping Harbor is a much more interesting location. Between the Chinese dragons roaming around, the fireworks, the cool architecture, it's a super neat world. I love how dark the water is, the random fireworks you can set off for points, and walking around on the ships. This world also introduces these green blocks that explode instantly when touched, meaning the only way to clear them out is TNT. There are even some cool bits where you have to lead ghosts carrying gunpowder around and use a dragon to light it up and clear the way. The game really starts to get challenging here, and I had to do a lot more thinking as I pushed through towards the Gem of Wisdom. The music here is great too. In fact, the whole game has a surprisingly good soundtrack. Hell, Cleopatra is one of my favorite songs in the whole series, and the rest of the tunes from the menu theme to Pak-Ping Harbor are all surprisingly good. Aside from Crystal Cave, of course, they all feel like real places in this fictional Pac world. There's another bonus level here too, and thankfully it's not as awful as the last one. It's not good, but it's not terrible either. Although I can't get over how bad these ghosts look. With the Gem of Wisdom under our belt, we can finally head on over to Haunted Halloween, get the final gem, and go toe-to-toe with Mesmerelda, the evil witch from earlier. Once again, there are a few neat threats to deal with here, like the electric floors, but it's mostly just the same maze running and crate moving ordeal. The bonus round this time, though, is actually kinda cool. You've got to run through conveyors of those green skull crates, avoid lightning, and make it to the fruit at the end 7 times. Not easy in the slightest, but an interesting distraction. Most of the difficulty comes from the controls kind of sucking, but still a nice change of pace, I guess. The game's movement is grid-based as far as I can tell, so sometimes being between squares thanks to conveyor belts moving makes the game a bit confused and causes you to run into things unexpectedly or not be able to move in the right direction at all. Most of the time this wasn't a serious issue, but there were a few puzzles that simply did not seem to work because of this. Seriously, some of these were nearly frame perfect. It's difficult enough to get the movement down, but having it only work half the time in the first place doesn't help. Unfortunately, once we grab the Gem of Courage, Mesmerelda steals all the Gems of Virtue, and now we have to face... Jesus Christ, what the hell is that thing? It reminds me of those eldritch horror renditions of Pac-Man. Thankfully, avoiding him isn't too tough, and I reached the end without any real issue. This leads into the real fight with Mesmerelda, where you have to run around a small maze, avoiding projectiles and hitting her with rockets. Once you take out Mesmerelda, she drops a key and flees. Turns out the gems are useless without access to her crystal ball, which is locked in her tower. At this point, we get another level in Cleopatra. You can see we actually have the key as an item now, so as it turns out, those green blocks from earlier can only be removed with this key. To make things worse, we need a shit ton of stars to actually beat the game. So guess what? We have to go back and replay every level again with the new key until we have nearly every star. I absolutely hate this design choice. I'm not sure if this is just something I've picked up, but this game is incredibly similar to Crash Bandicoot. The TNT crates, the green crates that kill you on impact, having to collect all the crates versus needing all the dots, content being locked until after you progress to a certain point. That last part is why I've never been a huge fan of the original Crash, as you had to collect specific gems to be able to get all the boxes on a few levels. I hate this idea of being forced to backtrack in order to complete everything, but Maze Madness not only does this more frequently, it also requires you to go back at 100% levels in order to beat the damn game. Even if you know what you're doing, you can't even get close to the required star amount without grabbing this key and being forced to go back. It's an absolute nightmare. Let me tell you, going through these levels again is abysmal. Once you know the puzzle solutions, it's just a matter of getting to the locked area, grabbing what you missed, and moving on. It's incredibly time-consuming and super repetitive. And to make matters worse, there are several instances that try to screw you over and force you to restart. For example, going up here with the Witch's Key will prevent you from collecting the dots below. So what you're supposed to do is progress to the next checkpoint, then walk all the way back, wait for the moving platforms, and then go up and use the key. One thing I will praise this game for is the dot radar, which shows any remaining dots in the area and where they're located. It is incredibly handy for trying to collect them all, especially since some of them are a bit obscured. It's not perfect though, as I went down following the radar to grab the last 2 out of over 500 dots and walked right into the level goal that was off screen. So now I've got to go back and collect all 500 again. Finally, after replaying nearly every level and grabbing all the stars in the 4 extra stages, the true final boss is unlocked. We round things off with another chase from Goblin, and finally take on Mesmerelda to reclaim our gems. This time, avoiding Goblin is actually really difficult, and it took me a multitude of tries. You'd think a game where all you can do is move in 4 directions would make creating a good boss challenging, but they managed to pull it off and do it really well. I really don't mind any of these fights, even if the Goblin chase is much tougher than the actual final fight. Ms. Pac-Man uses the gem and Pactrometer to restore the castle, and turn Mesmerelda back into the Pac Princess. The worlds are back in order, and the day is saved. Except, of course, for the fact that the witch who cursed the princess in the first place is still out there, whoever she is, but that's for that bastard Pac-Man to solve. Or maybe it would have been tackled in the cancelled sequel, who knows. We unlock one final bonus level to shoot boats and make the credits appear, and then our journey ends. But there's still a couple of side options to cover. For one, the original arcade title is here. It's a great copy of the original, and while not a perfect conversion, it's still just as fun as it was those many years ago. In addition, there's also a multiplayer option with 3 different modes. Dot Mania, where you have to be the first to eat 80 dots, Ghost Tag, where 3 ghosts hunt down 1 pack person before they eat 50 dots, or Da Bomb, which is basically just hot potato. They're not bad, but they're definitely not going to convince anyone to rush out and pick the game up. Maze Madness takes the original concept of Ms. Pac-Man and modernizes it by adding some puzzle and collection elements. Switching between maze gameplay and puzzles does help break up the pace, but the game quickly wears thin once you get the Witch's Key and are required to go back for 50 stars, which is about 70% completion just to finish the game properly. The first run through isn't bad by any means. It's a really interesting experience and unlike anything else I've ever played, but it is not fun to grind through, and that final boss ruined the game for me, even though I enjoyed a lot of the aspects. Maze Madness is a fun and unique take on the maze formula, but it overstays its welcome with some very archaic design. Now that we've completed our quest with Ms. Pac-Man, let's go check in on the original Ghost Gobbler and see what he's been up to in Pac-Man Adventures in Time. Just gotta put the disc in my PlayStation here, and...
Oops, you have to put the CD in your computer.
Oh, yeah, Adventures in Time is a PC game. Okay, computer, surely you can run a program from 20 years ago without issue, right?
One eternity later.
Okay, after a lot of troubleshooting, here we are. Man, this old computer game vibe really brings me back. I love how every little menu option is a balloon, and when you select it, it makes them pop. Anyway, pretty similar to Maze Madness, we have the main quest along with some side modes. So let's dive into that main quest, shall we? The quest begins with Professor Pac-Man telling us the story of the Artifact, a legendary power pellet that's protected the planet from evil for 1,000 years. Unfortunately, it's been stolen and smashed into 4 pieces by Mollusk, this creepy evil-looking guy here. He takes the 4 fragments and, you'll never believe it, sends them into the past. Now it's up to us to use the Professor's time machine to recover the pieces, starting in the prehistoric era. You'll be flung through time to ancient Egypt, medieval times, the Wild West, and finally the future. Unlike the last Pac-Man game involving time travel, it actually makes good use of the concept. Adventures in Time is much closer to the original style. To progress, you have to collect all the dots in the maze while avoiding the 4 ghosts and other hazards. You can still grab power pellets to gobble up ghosts, getting 1600 points is still tough but feels fantastic to pull off, and any collision with a ghost means you lose a life. And returning from Pac-Mania, you can jump to avoid ghosts. As you clear mazes, they introduce more and more mechanics like hills that are slow to climb but fast to descend, elevators, boulders, swimming, dragons, feral hogs, minecarts, seesaws, basically a ton of new stuff. Not to mention the unique levels like this one where you're running across train cars before they're decoupled, or this one based on a tree trunk. There are also lots of bonus stages in between mazes, some being memory-based, requiring quick reflexes or a chase sequence. They're not as exceptional as the main maze gameplay, but they're an alright way to break up the pace here and there. The game can be pretty tough too. It only saves every few mazes, and it doesn't reset your lives when you die, so you can find yourself needing to beat several tough mazes in a row on just a single life, and they progressively get more difficult to obtain. Thankfully, you can add them by using a code. Believe it or not, this game contains cheat codes you can enter on the pause screen. There's some cool and helpful stuff in here, and there are times where I definitely had to grab an extra life to get to the next save point. God, there are just so many cool little details in here. Nearly every level has a unique ghost costume, there are all sorts of new enemies and hazards to deal with, the different eras have so many cool set pieces and locations to run around in. Once Pac-Man obtains all the pieces of the artifact, the time machine malfunctions and sends us to the future. Our final test is to find an energy source to travel back home. You run through futuristic cities and labs until eventually you run around on a fuel rod and get blasted back home. Pac-Man appears in Mollusk's cave with the artifact just after it's destroyed, and using its power, he special beam cannons Mollusk to oblivion. The ghosts flee in terror, and Pac-Man celebrates triumphantly. The day is saved. It's a simple but satisfying little story. After your quest, you can play any of the mazes from the campaign by themselves. Each maze has a target number of ghosts to eat and fruit to collect. Completing the maze will unlock even more bonus levels. Unlike our last game, completing these is actually pretty fun. If you complete it all, including the bonus and super bonus stages, your reward for full completion is one final maze. The original classic maze from Pac-Man. It's a super cool bonus for your hard work, and it feels like the perfect little way to round everything off. I love it when games do stuff like this, like Sonic Adventure 2 containing Green Hill Zone if you collect all the emblems. Just like last time, we've got some multiplayer options here too. In fact, they're the exact same options as last time. However, there's also now an online play option for the multiplayer too, which is super cool considering how old this game is. I'll be honest though, I didn't even try to get it to work. Getting the game to run was enough of a struggle. I have no idea if the online features still function. There's less to say about this game than Maze Madness, but that's in no way a bad thing. Adventures in Time trims a ton of the fat from Maze Madness while continually introducing new, interesting mechanics that don't take away the focus from the mazes. It's just classic arcade Pac-Man with some new complexities, excellent mazes, and fun music. It's different enough from the original Maze game to feel modern and more engaging, but the core of what made it so addicting and fun is still present and just as strong as ever. It's an absolute blast, and if you're interested, I've left the download link in the description below. Either way, it's by far the best Pac-Man game about time travel by a mile.
Out of the way, you!
So now that just leaves us with our final game. Also on PC, we have Ms. Pac-Man: Quest for the Golden Maze. By this point, I'm getting pretty sick of the Egyptian theme. Definitely seems like some Maze Madness assets were reused in both Adventures in Time and especially Golden Maze, but hey, I loved Adventures in Time, so I'm giving this the benefit of the doubt here. Adventures in Time cut the more experimental changes of Maze Madness to focus on the more classic arcade gameplay. Quest for the Golden Maze now cuts the new mechanics of Adventures in Time to even more closely replicate the original. Another way to put it is it cuts out anything fun and interesting. You're still collecting dots to clear stages, but there's no jump, no extra obstacles or use of 3D, just pure 2D mazes. And the only real change here is the power-ups. Power-ups and score boosts will appear and move around the stage for you to collect. Some only appear in the center of each stage after eating a baby ghost. These power-ups aren't super interesting. Score multipliers, brief invincibility, super speed, a dot magnet. They're helpful, but not earth-shattering. The other new addition here is that upon entering one of the teleporters in the maze, there's a chance you'll enter a bonus stage where you have to collect all the fruit within a certain time frame. If you do, you'll collect a golden fruit that's worth 100 times the regular amount. These stages are actually pretty cool, and they require some thought and planning to complete within the time frame. Unfortunately, the fact that entering them is completely random ruins it for me. It's usually just a jarring transition that breaks the flow while I'm trying to navigate the current maze. One change I really do appreciate though is the fact that you can select any stage you've gotten to from the main menu, unlike Adventures in Time. Plus, you'll get the same number of lives every time to help you out. It's a bit more forgiving, and I do appreciate that change. You may have noticed by this point that despite coming out after Adventures in Time, it looks a bit more like a hot steaming pile of garbage. While I mentioned the last game having a ton of charm, I describe this one more as just cheap looking. The menus look rough, the cutscenes are awful, and the game itself isn't looking too hot either. I even ran into an audio glitch where the game just screeched into my headset and I threw it off in a knee-jerk reaction. I think Adventures in Time proved that you don't have to make a lot of changes to make these maze games fun, but Quest for the Golden Maze just feels lifeless and dull without any exceptional ideas of its own. On the bright side, at least the main quest is really short. If for some reason you still want more, you can play through a limited number of mazes in a 2-player mode, but otherwise that's it for this game. Which means we've covered every single Ms. Pac-Man game. Her legacy ends not with a bang, but a whimper. The legacy for the maze games too, for that matter, as we really haven't seen another attempt at anything like these games since, which is kind of a shame. Despite its flaws, Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness proves this old arcade style can be modernized and make for a fun and interesting experience. And on the other side of the coin, there's still a lot to get out of the genre without needing to make any radical changes, as shown in Pac-Man Adventures in Time. It's a shame we haven't seen anything like these games since, but thankfully they're still enjoyable today. Maze Madness has been ported to several platforms, and there's even a halfway decent GBA port. Adventures in Time may only be available on PC, but its age means it's pretty easy to get a copy of somewhere on the internet. It also means it can be a bit difficult to get to run properly, but not impossible. These two games are really great, and Pac-Man Adventures in Time especially is one of my highlights of the series so far. But next up is the trilogy of games this franchise is known best for, outside of the original arcade titles of course, Pac-Man World. I know these games get a lot of nostalgia and love from some people, so I'm really excited to see what all the fuss is about. What can this little guy offer the 3D platformer genre? I guess we'll have to find out on the next episode. Until then, I'll see you all next time. Take care.